Um, what if I told you that the destruction of ancient empires had absolutely nothing to do with divine wrath?
It's a pretty wild premise to start with, honestly.
Right. But what if it had everything to do with a rigid, basically inescapable mathematical formula?
Yeah, that completely changes how you look at the historical data.
Exactly. So today we are tossing that whole mystical role of the cosmic dice right out the window. We're looking at a text that is well over a millennium old.
And we are definitely not reading it as a collection of theological bedtime stories.
No, not at all. We're reading it as the ultimate, uncompromising textbook on social physics. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, the source material today for you listening is this incredibly dense, just profound set of lecture notes. They analyze a very specific section of the Quran.
Right, Surah Hud, verses 96 to 109.
Yeah, exactly. But the true hook for you is the specific lens we're using. These notes interpret the verses through the highly analytical framework of the late philosopher Ghulam Ahmed Parwez.
And setting the tone right from the outset is just so crucial here.
Oh, for sure.
Because in the framework Parwez presents, societal collapse is never framed as some sort of mystery. It's not an arbitrary lightning bolt from the sky.
Right. It's not just God waking up on the wrong side of the bed.
Exactly. It's a mathematical certainty. It is the unavoidable, cumulative consequence of collective human choices.
So when we talk about social physics, we're talking about a diagnostic landscape.
Yes, where actions have absolute quantifiable reactions on a massive civilizational scale.
Wow. So our mission for this deep dive is to look completely past the traditional orthodox interpretations, right?
We have to. We are going to explore the hidden mechanics of society. We are asking the really fundamental questions here.
Like, why do civilizations actually fall?
Yeah, and perhaps more chillingly, how do massive populations willingly, almost eagerly, trade their long-term survival for short-term comfort?
Man, that is the premise that grabbed me immediately. Because it treats history not as a series of just unfortunate events, but as a laboratory.
A very clinical laboratory, actually.
Yeah. Because before the text even gets to the core verses we are unpacking today, it sets up a precedent.
It does. It walks us through the historical case studies presented just prior to verse 96.
Right. It goes through the fates of the people of Noah, Ayat, Thamud, and Shuaib. And reading through this, I felt like I was looking at a medical chart for dead societies.
A medical history of societal collapse is the perfect way to frame it, honestly.
Yeah, because it wasn't about which society failed to perform some specific ritual. It was like a catalog of socioeconomic diseases.
Exactly. The source insists that we must strip away the mythological aura surrounding these ancient fables. They are raw data.
Okay, so let's look at the first chart on the clipboard then. Noah's people.
Right. So the analysis points out that they didn't collapse because of a flood in a vacuum.
Right.
The structural integrity of their society was already entirely rotten due to rigid, just unyielding class divisions.
Wow.
Yeah. The elite absolutely refused to share physical or social space with the working class.
So they looked at the artisans, the laborers, the people whose sweat literally built their world and viewed them as intrinsically lesser human beings.
Exactly. It was hyper-stratification.
Almost like a caste system built entirely on contempt.
Right. And if you have a society where the foundation is completely alienated and despised by the penthouse, that skyscraper is coming down.
The friction alone will just tear it apart.
Exactly.
But then the text moves to the civilization of Ad. And this is where my assumptions were completely upended.
Ad is a fascinating case study.
It really is. The source describes Ad as a civilization of immense scientific and civil prowess. There's this beautiful note saying they reached for the stars and took pictures of the moon.
Yeah, they were essentially the apex tech giants of their era.
But that paradox is deeply relevant to any modern observer. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Because they possessed unparalleled scientific insight, what the text refers to as basarat.
Basarat.
Yeah. They knew how to manipulate the physical world to create a utopia. But they completely lacked a moral or equitable compass for the application of that technology.
So they built their towering monuments and luxury infrastructure by literally extracting the lifeblood of the vulnerable.
Exactly. They had the science to build a paradise, but they weaponized that same intellectual power to ruthlessly exploit the poor.
Wow. It was a civilization that basically equated technological advancement with absolute superiority.
Right, just totally ignoring the human cost.
Which brings me to the big question I scribbled in the margins here. If a society like Alad is so scientifically advanced, how does the text mathematically justify their total collapse?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. From a purely utilitarian perspective, shouldn't their technology have saved them? I mean, we tend to think that if we could just invent the right machine, we can innovate our way out of ruin.
And that assumption is exactly what the Parwezian framework dismantles. It introduces the foundational concept of this entire analysis, Makafat-e-Amal,
Which translates to what?
the law of requital. In this paradigm, the universe operates on an inflexible ledger.
Oh, a ledger.
Yeah, it tracks the balance of destructive and constructive actions. Scientific knowledge alone, if divorced from equity, cannot save a society from bankruptcy.
So if your society's destructive actions, the exploitation, the hoarding, outweigh its constructive actions, collapse is an absolute physical inevitability.
Exactly. Gravity does not care how brilliant an engineer you are if you consciously choose to step off a cliff.
That is so well put.
Hmm.
The law of requital is blind to your tech achievements if your foundation is unjust.
Right. It's basically like thermodynamics.
Yeah, you can't cheat the energy transfer. If you build a system generating massive heat and friction through exploitation, that energy has to go somewhere.
It eventually burns the whole system down.
So Award had the tech, but their societal ledger was bleeding red. And then we moved to Thamud.
Right, the third case study.
And the text identifies them not as tech giants, but as agricultural monopolists.
Thamud represents the fatal disease of the privatization of survival.
Privatization of survival. That's a heavy phrase.
Because they looked at the natural resources, the springs, the fertile pastures, and they drew fences around them.
They hoarded the water for their own elite livestock.
Yeah, leaving the poor to literally fight over muddy puddles. They restricted access to the basic sustenance of life purely to inflate their own wealth.
It's a textbook case of resource monopoly, leading to social strangulation.
Exactly. When a society permits a small faction to own the means of universal survival, it creates a massive pressure cooker of desperation.
I instantly map that onto modern conversations about, like, corporate water rights or the privatization of seeds.
The mechanics of human greed really haven't changed in thousands of years.
No, they haven't. And finally, the text outlines Shu'aib's people.
Right, the corrupt industrialists and traders.
They were just hoarding. They were actively manipulating the market itself.
Yeah, shortchanging the artisans, utilizing black market tactics. They systematically tipped the scales to maximize profit while actively starving the producers.
So when you synthesize all four of these historical data points, Noah, Ad, Thamud, and Shu'aib, what's the common denominator?
You realize there are different manifestations of the exact same underlying pathology.
Which is?
The hoarding of resources, the systemic denial of universal human dignity, and the illusion that you can somehow cheat consequence.
And the text provides this historical data to prove a mathematical point before we even get to the core verses.
Right. Neither wealth nor military might nor advanced technology can prevent a civilizational collapse if the societal ledger is unbalanced.
Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate archetype of a civilization that thought it was entirely too big to fail.
Ancient Egypt under Pharaoh.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are entering the main focus of today's deep dive, Surah Hud, verses 96 to 99. This grand showdown between Moses and Pharaoh.
And setting the stage here is intensely psychological.
It really is, because Moses doesn't just show up to Pharaoh's court with, like, a philosophical debate about divine law.
Right. The text specifically notes that Moses brings sultan.
Sultan, let's break that down.
Sultan is a critical term. It means authority or substantive proof backed by actual power.
Because in this framework, a law without the power to enforce it is merely a philosophical suggestion.
Exactly. It might be a beautiful thought, but it changes nothing in the material world.
So Moses arrives with the mandate to implement a balanced system.
But the profound tragedy highlighted here is not just his conflict with Pharaoh.
No, it's the reaction of the general public.
Right. When Moses presents this balanced, equitable system, the deen, the populace, entirely ignores him.
And instead, they choose to blindly follow Pharaoh's command, which the text calls amor.
Yes. The Amor of Pharaoh.
And this is where the text made me stop and just reread the page 3 times. I had to ask, why?
The most confusing part on the surface.
Yeah. Why on earth would an entire population look at a man offering them liberation and equity and then willingly choose to follow a dictator leading them to absolute ruin?
Did they just hate Moses?
That was my initial thought. Is it just human nature to be cartoonishly stubborn?
And that is where the Parwezian insight drops a massive philosophical bombshell. It had nothing to do with hating Moses.
Then what was it?
The populace followed Pharaoh because they willingly, consciously traded their reason for security.
Trading reason for security. Man, that is hauntingly familiar.
It is the ultimate psychological trap of authoritarianism. You have to understand the deep generational trauma at play here.
The trauma of dependency. Right?
Exactly. When a population is subjugated for long enough, their cognitive horizons shrink dramatically.
So they preferred the familiar tyrant, the dictator who ruthlessly controlled them but reliably threw them their daily rations.
Right. They preferred that over the unfamiliar freedom and the terrifying responsibility demanded by the divine system.
Because freedom is exhausting.
Very exhausting. It requires critical thought, effort, and individual responsibility. Subjugation just requires compliance.
It's the horrific comfort of the cage.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if you step outside the cage, you might starve, you have to hunt, build your own shelter. And inside the cage, the zookeeper might beat you, but he feeds you at 5 p.m. every day.
And it is deeply, uncomfortably human to choose the familiar abuse over the terrifying unknown of liberty.
It really is. And to explain how a populace gets locked into this state of compliant paralysis, the text outlines what it calls the 3 curses of humanity.
This is a brilliant, 3-pronged societal attack.
And honestly, if you look at any major historical collapse, you see this exact triad.
It's an unholy trinity of societal control. The first curse is political dictatorship, represented historically by Pharaoh.
Which is the absolute centralization of power.
Right. The monopoly on physical force. It's the state apparatus enforcing compliance through violence or the threat of violence.
Okay, so that's the guy with the army. It's the brute force.
Exactly.
But brute force is expensive, and people eventually rebel against pure violence, so you need the second curse.
Right. Corrupt capitalists or monopolists, represented in the text by a figure named Qarun.
Qarun. So he represents the economic stranglehold.
Yes. He is the one extracting the wealth, hoarding resources, and keeping the public entirely dependent on an economic system that never actually sustains them.
He controls the livelihood, ensuring the population is too busy scrambling for crumbs to ever organize a resistance against Pharaoh's army.
Exactly. Pharaoh holds the sword, and Qarun holds the wallet.
But even that isn't enough to permanently pacify a human mind.
No, because eventually, someone will look at the sword and the wallet and realize the system is completely unjust.
Right. They'll realize it violates the basic laws of fairness, and that is where the third curse comes in, which to me is the most insidious one.
The corrupt religious priesthood, represented by Haman.
Haman, how does he fit in?
Haman is the psychological linchpin of the entire corrupt system. How does a tyrant maintain control without fighting a rebellion every single day?
By convincing the populace that the tyranny is divinely ordained.
Precisely. Haman represents the priesthood or the ideological apparatus that manufactures the narrative. They provide Pharaoh with his divine right to rule.
It's psychological warfare. You don't need a soldier on every street corner if you can put a cop inside every citizen's head.
Exactly. Haman's job is to tell the starving masses that their suffering is actually the mysterious will of God.
That questioning the dictator isn't just illegal, it's actually a cosmic sin.
Right. So when these 3 forces unite the political tyrant, the economic monopolist, and the corrupt priesthood, the public is utterly paralyzed.
They can't fight back physically because of Pharaoh.
They cannot fight back economically because of Qarun.
And crucially, they cannot fight back spiritually or intellectually because Haman has convinced them that resistance is a violation of the universe itself.
They are trapped in a perfectly engineered triangle of subjugation.
Which leads to a terrifying practical question for you, the listener. If you are inside that triangle, how can you objectively tell if your leader's command is leading you to ruin?
Because when you are born inside that system, the propaganda is just the air you breathe.
It just feels like everyday life. But the genius of these lecture notes is that they give us a linguistic, mathematical litmus test to evaluate leadership.
Yes, the text focuses intensely on the very end of verse 97, where the Quran makes a definitive statement regarding Pharaoh.
Right. It declares that Pharaoh's command was not Rashid.
Rashid. We need to break that word open, because it carries so much weight in this analysis.
Yeah, let's do it. The source defines Rashid as rightly guided. But it's crucial to strip away the vague, mystical connotations we usually attach to that.
Absolutely. In this framework, Rashid means a command firmly rooted in intellect, reason, empirical reality, and above all, balanced equity for the public good.
And this definition introduces a radical concept regarding authority within the Nizam-e-Rubaiyat.
Right, which translates to the divine system of nourishment and sustenance.
In this system, a leader's power is absolutely never unconditional.
The divine right of kings does not exist here. A leader's authority is strictly conditional.
Conditional on the metric of being Rashid.
Exactly. If a leader's command is not rational, if it doesn't serve the balanced nourishment of the society, the text argues a revolutionary point.
That the people don't just have the right to reject it.
They have an absolute, uncompromising duty to reject it.
Compliance with an irrational, destructive command is actually a violation of the law of requital.
Right. And there is a vivid metaphor used in the source text that perfectly illustrates this dynamic: the shepherd and the flock.
Okay, yeah. The notes argue that a leader is essentially a shepherd.
Right, and if a shepherd guides his flock to a lush green pasture where they can thrive, he is doing his job. He is exercising valid Rashid authority.
But Pharaoh was a shepherd who was actively, consciously leading his flock to a toxic, poisoned watering hole.
The Arabic phrase here is Baisa al-Werd al-Marud, an utterly wretched, doomed place to be led, a destination of absolute ruin.
And reading that, the true horror clicked for me. The ultimate tragedy isn't just that Pharaoh was a bad shepherd.
Bad shepherds exist throughout all of history.
Right. The terrifying tragedy is that the sheep just kept walking.
They saw the water was toxic. They smelled the poison.
They saw the cliff approaching.
Yeah.
And they just kept walking directly into the fire because they had entirely surrendered their intellect to the shepherd.
They traded their own critical thinking for the comfort of following the crowd and obeying authority.
And the consequences of that blind obedience, of surrendering your intellect to an irrational system, are not minor.
Not at all. The text makes it mathematically clear. It doesn't just result in a bad economy for a decade.
Right, it results in civilizational erasure. When a society continuously obeys commands that are not Rashid, they write themselves out of history.
But the mechanics of that surrender are fascinating.
Yeah, that's what kept nagging at me. How do you actually keep an entire population sleepwalking into a toxic watering hole?
We touched on Haman and the corrupt priesthood, but the source goes into granular detail about how Haman actually accomplishes this.
And it isn't through magic.
No, it is through the systematic weaponization of language.
Semantic hijacking. It is brilliant and terrifying.
This is perhaps one of the most sophisticated sociological observations found in the entire text.
Because civilizations are rarely pacified by physical force alone over the long term, right?
Exactly. They are pacified when the ruling class fundamentally alters the actual dictionary meaning of words.
You don't need to ban the revolutionary text. You don't need to pile the books in the town square and burn them.
Which usually just creates martyrs anyway.
Yeah. You just change the definitions of the words inside the book. So the population reads the exact same revolutionary text, but they interpret it in a way that puts them right to sleep.
The text provides two flawless examples of this semantic hijacking, focusing on two foundational concepts: shukr and sabr.
Okay, let's dissect shukr first.
If you ask almost anyone today what shukr means, they will tell you it means gratitude.
Sort of passive thankfulness to God. Like if you have half a piece of stale bread while the king feasts, you say shukr, you accept your lot in life, and you don't complain.
But the Parwezian linguistic analysis dismantles that entirely. The original linguistic root of shukr is not about passive gratitude at all.
It's about maximizing hidden potential, right?
Yes. The root of the word describes a biological reality, like the fully loaded udder of a cow or a camel.
Wait, an udder? Like a biological potential?
Exactly. The potential for nourishment is there, but it requires effort to bring it into manifestation. You have to milk the cow.
So true shukrs means taking whatever resources, intellect, or capabilities you have and working tirelessly to maximize them for the betterment of humanity.
It is an intensely active, dynamic concept.
It's the difference between saying thank you for this seed and actually planting the seed, watering it, and growing a forest.
Right. And what did the corrupt priesthood, the Hamans of the world, do?
They stripped the kinetic energy completely out of the word.
They redefined shukr to mean be grateful for your poverty, accept your subjugation, and know that your reward is in the next life.
They turned a word meant to inspire human development into a tool for compliance.
And they executed the exact same linguistic assassination on the concept of saber.
Man. So what did saber originally mean?
In its uncorrupted form, saber meant steadfastness, relentless, immovable resilience in the pursuit of a righteous Rashid goal.
So it was the stamina to stand firm on the battlefield of life, to face opposition, and to never retreat from building a just society.
Resilience with a purpose.
But it was corrupted. The priesthood warped saber to mean passive suffering.
Just sit quietly, endure the abuse of the tyrant, endure the economic starvation, and do absolutely nothing about it.
Because God is with the passively patient. It's like telling someone in a burning house that the most righteous thing they can do is sit in a chair and tolerate the heat.
It's a perfect analogy, and to illustrate how deeply a public can be mesmerized by these manipulated concepts, the text expertly deploys the metaphor of Samiri's calf.
Oh, the golden calf from the Exodus story.
Yes. While Moses was away, a character named Samiri tricked the populace into worshiping a calf made of gold.
But the key detail the text focuses on is that the calf was hollow, right?
Exactly. When the wind blew through it, it produced a meaningless, lowing sound. It looked shiny, it looked valuable, and it made religious noises.
And the source uses this as a profound metaphor for how a society is distracted.
The public becomes mesmerized by shiny illusions, superficial wealth, and hollow, meaningless rituals provided by the priesthood.
They worship the comforting noise of the calf instead of undertaking the difficult, grueling work of building an equitable society.
They act under the engineered illusion that participating in empty rituals is the pinnacle of virtue.
They literally trade the heavy lifting of justice for the comforting hum of an illusion.
But the universe, and this is where the math comes back in, cannot be tricked by fake dictionary definitions.
No, gravity still works whether you redefine the word fall or not.
The universe keeps its strict, unalterable ledger. Which brings us to a section of the notes brilliantly titled, The Engine of Reason.
The engine of reason. We are transitioning into the analysis of Ayat 100, which opens with the phrase, Dalika min anbalil Qara.
Which means, that is from the news or the history of the cities.
The Quran then categorizes all these historical cities into two distinct types. It says some are still standing, referred to as Qaim, and others are completely mown down, referred to as Hasid.
Right.
Now, when I first read this, my immediate thought was, is this just a depressing archaeological survey? Like, why are we cataloging the ruins of dead cities?
It's a fair question. What is the practical value for us today?
Exactly.
Well, the source material is adamant that this is not merely a history lesson. It is predictive analytics.
Predictive analytics.
Yes. The text is demanding that we engage our intellect and look at the raw data of human history. It's posing a deeply scientific question. What is the underlying variable?
Why is one society Qaim, standing, functional, living, while another is Hasid?
And we really need to pause on that word, Hasid.
Yeah, because the text emphasizes how brutal it is. It doesn't just mean a city that lost a battle.
No, it means harvested, mown down to its very roots, rendered completely biologically unable to produce anything ever again.
A sterilized field.
Right.
A civilization entirely erased from the equation of human progress.
The fundamental difference between the standing city and the sterilized field is precisely their adherence to the mathematical law of requital.
And this concept is firmly cemented in the very next verse, Ayat 101.
Which delivers what might be the most profound sociological truth in the entire text.
God did not wrong these cities, they wronged themselves. Zalamu anfusahum.
They wrong themselves. It's the ultimate statement of taking extreme ownership of your civilizational fate.
It shatters the whole myth of the external scapegoat.
Absolutely. The source insists on a paradigm-shifting concept here. An external enemy never, ever destroys a society first.
The internal rot precedes the external collapse.
Always. A society destroys itself from within long before the invaders arrive at the gates.
By choosing false, unbalanced systems. By allowing massive inequality. By following irrational non-Rashid leaders.
They hollow out their own foundations.
It totally makes me think of material fatigue and structural engineering. Well, you can have a massive steel bridge that looks perfectly fine on the outside, but inside, at a molecular level, microfractures are multiplying because the load is unbalanced.
Right.
The bridge doesn't collapse because a strong wind blew that day. The wind was just the final visible trigger. It collapsed because it had been structurally failing internally for decades.
The external collapse is merely the final symptom of an internal disease. That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
Thanks. So the urgent question becomes, how does a society avoid becoming Hasid?
How does it avoid being mown down? The source argues it requires more than just building stronger walls or amassing more wealth.
It requires a fundamental cognitive shift in how the society perceives time.
And this section of the notes completely blew my mind. We are looking at Ayat 102 and 103.
Specifically, the phrase that discusses the fear of the punishment of the hereafter, kafa adhaba al-akhirah.
Traditionally, when you hear fear of the hereafter, the immediate association is a post-death judgment.
Right, you think of hellfire, spiritual realms, divine tribunals.
But keeping our mission in mind today, the expert analysis reframes this deeply religious concept strictly through a socioeconomic lens.
So in this analytical framework, the hereafter, the Akhira, is not merely a ghost story meant to scare people into compliance.
No, it is the literal concept of the future.
Therefore, the fear of the hereafter translates practically to the fear of long-term consequences.
This reinterpretation is incredibly powerful. It suggests that a rational, thriving, quam society operates by looking far ahead of its immediate gratification.
So the speculation is that a functional civilization makes decisions by looking 50, maybe 100 years into the future.
They operate with a horizon in mind. They are asking the Rashid questions.
How does this economic policy affect our grandchildren? What is the 100-year consequence of polluting this water source?
Exactly. But a corrupt society, doomed to become Hasid, suffers from catastrophic myopia.
They only look at today's profit margin.
They will willingly sacrifice a century of stability for a quarterly earnings report or a temporary political victory.
And this temporal myopia brings us to one of the most striking concepts in the source text: the worship of the eternal yesterday.
The eternal yesterday.
If you're listening, really let that phrase sink in. How does the text define a society trapped in the eternal yesterday?
The text argues that dead or actively dying nations become obsessively fixated on their past glory.
Because they have no viable vision for the future, right?
Right, and because their present reality is miserable, they seek psychological refuge in history.
They figuratively carry the corpses of their ancestors on their shoulders.
They continuously celebrate what they used to be, erecting monuments to a romanticized past, while their actual future goes entirely bankrupt.
But living nations do not worship corpses.
No, they look at the horizon. They operate with the Akira, the long-term consequence, at the forefront of their collective consciousness.
To brilliantly illustrate what it looks like when a society abandons the horizon for short-term delusion, the text provides this incredible metaphor of the caravan.
It's a profound visualization of wasted societal potential.
Imagine a massive, incredibly wealthy merchant caravan. Hundreds of camels, laden with priceless goods.
They've been traveling for 6 grueling months across a deadly desert.
They've endured sandstorms,
Yeah.
fought off bandits, rationed water, bleeding and sweating to guard this wealth.
All fueled by the vision of the thriving metropolis they are trying to reach.
A place where they can trade, prosper, and elevate their entire community. And finally, they arrive.
But the corrupt leader of the caravan, the Pharaoh figure, who is entirely devoid of Rashid, doesn't lead them to a metropolis.
No, he orders them to unpack and unload everything in a completely barren, desolate market where there is absolutely no one to buy their goods.
It is the ultimate tragedy of misdirected energy. All that incredible potential, all that stored value, utterly wasted.
The text uses this caravan as a direct proxy for a civilization that throws away its human capital.
When you have a society overflowing with brilliant minds, vast resources, and incredible youth energy.
But your socioeconomic system is designed to stifle innovation, suppress justice, and funnel wealth to a tiny minority.
You are dumping your priceless cargo in a dead market.
You are taking the boundless potential of the human intellect and starving it.
Wasting human potential for absolutely nothing.
And the laws of social physics dictate that this massive societal friction cannot simply disappear.
No, it reaches a boiling point. It builds until it leads to an inescapable clash.
Which brings us to the final analytical section of these notes, the inescapable math.
We are now unpacking Ayat 104 to 108.
These verses speak of a moment called the Day of Witnessing, Yaman Mashhud.
And they describe the grip of consequence using 2 very specific, severe words, Shadid and Alim.
Let's look at Yaman Mashhud first. The notes strip away the apocalyptic imagery here too, right?
Right. It describes this not as a magical day that drops out of the sky without warning, but as a point of physical, mathematical, critical mass.
It is the exact moment when all those hidden potentialities, the microfractures and the suppressed injustices, finally manifest and violently clash in the open.
The analogy the source provides here is masterful. It asks us to imagine a seed buried deep under a heavy, suffocating rock.
Okay, a seed under a rock.
That seed contains the intrinsic potential for life, for explosive energy, but it is suppressed by the weight above it.
So eventually, one of 2 things must happen.
Either the seed finds a microscopic crack and bursts forth into life, breaking the rock in the process.
Or the immense, unrelenting friction and heat of that suppression creates a spark that simply burns everything down.
Yamun Mashhad is the day that spark catches. It's the public manifestation of a society's accumulated actions.
It's the day the ledger balances itself, violently if necessary, and the words that text uses to describe this consequence are uncompromisingly harsh.
Shadid, which means severe or firm.
And alim, which means excruciatingly painful.
I have to admit, reading this, I felt some friction. I thought, if this law of requital is supposed to be perfectly balanced, why is the consequence described as being so incredibly harsh? Doesn't that sound like anger? It's a totally understandable question. To explain why it must be shadid and alim, the text uses the medical boil metaphor.
The surgery metaphor, this is what made it click for me.
When a society's corruption, its injustice, monopolies, tyranny reaches its absolute peak, the text likens it to a massive, deeply infected boil on the physical body of humanity.
And the divine law of consequence, the balancing of the ledger, acts as the surgeon's scalpel.
Now, lancing a deep, toxic, infected boil is agonizingly painful.
The process of removing the infection is alim, painful.
And the grip of the surgeon holding the scalpel must be utterly firm, unyielding, and severe shadid so his hand doesn't slip during the operation.
And what the text emphasizes is that there is no intercessor in that operating room.
No one can walk in and bribe the surgeon to stop halfway through because the patient is screaming.
Right. The pain of societal collapse, the pain of the ledger balancing is severe, but it is framed as a necessary mercy.
The corruption must be forcefully lanced so the broader body of humanity can survive, regenerate, and heal.
It's not arbitrary torture. It is emergency, life-saving surgery for the human species.
And the aftermath of this surgery leaves us with two categories of people, perfectly mathematically defined in the concluding verses.
The wretched, referred to as Shaqi, and the fortunate, referred to as Sa'id.
The concept of wretchedness here is described in Ayat 109 as a state of perpetual agony.
The text uses the imagery of sighing and screaming as long as the heavens and the earth endure.
But keeping our analytical lens focused, this is not just about a fiery afterlife. It is a profound psychological metaphor for a society trapped in a living death.
A living death because they consciously chose to blindly follow the corrupted paths of their forefathers.
They are wretched because they traded their reason, their critical intellect, for the illusion of security.
Because they let the corrupt shepherd lead them to poisoned water, and they worship the hollow noise of the golden calf instead of doing the hard work of building justice.
Every action they take within that corrupt system only produces more friction, more suppression, and more pain.
Conversely, the fortunate, the Sa'id, are those whose constructive actions, guided by intellect and a Rashid long-term vision, yield perpetual fruits.
They planted the seed in fertile soil. They maximized their shukr and maintained their sabr in the face of adversity.
Their societal ledger is balanced, and therefore their society is quaim, it stands, it thrives, and it nourishes humanity.
It really is an incredible framework.
I think we need to take a step back and just distill the immense journey we've taken through these notes today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. We started with the radical premise that societal collapse is not a mystery, but a mathematical certainty, a symptom of social physics.
We explored how, when a population trades their intellect for the illusion of security under a familiar tyrant, they physically set the clock ticking on their own historical demise.
We analyzed how the trinity of political tyranny, economic monopoly, and religious manipulation completely paralyzes a public.
We saw how language itself is weaponized by the elite, turning words of action and resilience into tools of passive suffering and compliance.
And we learned that failing to look 100 years into the future, choosing instead to worship the corpses of an eternal yesterday, inevitably ends in a society becoming a seed mown down to its very roots.
The universe's law of requital does not care about our excuses.
No, it doesn't care about our shiny technology, our towering monuments, or the comforting noises of our golden calves.
It only cares about the math. It only balances the ledger.
It is incredibly heavy, but I also find it fundamentally empowering.
Empowering.
How so? Because by removing the element of arbitrary cosmic wrath, it places the responsibility for our survival squarely back on our own choices.
That's very true.
It means our future is entirely in our hands. Now, for the teaser, we spent this entire extensive deep dive thoroughly analyzing the architecture of destruction.
We understand the mechanics of how societies collapse.
But the lingering question is, how do we actively prevent it once the decay has already started?
And that is exactly where the source material is heading next.
Yes. In the subsequent lecture encompassing verses 110 to 114, the paradigm entirely shifts from diagnosis to treatment.
We will be exploring the actual practical societal roles of what the text calls the establishment of salat and patience.
And again, the analysis will strip away the traditional view of these as mere physical rituals, reframing them as dynamic structural tools for actively rebuilding a broken society.
It's going to be a fascinating follow-up.
I absolutely cannot wait to get into the mechanics of rebuilding. But before we leave you today, we want to give you, the listener, a final provocative thought to mull over.
We spent a lot of time talking about how the survival of a civilization requires looking far into the future.
Rejecting the comfort of the familiar tyrant and refusing to carry the corpses of the past.
So ask yourself, when you look at the landscape of your own life and your own community, what is the eternal yesterday that your society is currently worshiping?
What romanticized dead past are we clinging to? And more importantly, what long-term future, what horizon are you personally sacrificing just to keep that illusion alive?
Because remember, we aren't just looking at the muddy waters of history.
No. We are looking at a mathematical ledger. And the ledger is always balancing